What mission has the U.S. accomplished in Syria? It remains unclear what effect, if any, the U.S.-led strikes had on alleviating the suffering of Syrians. U.S. President Donald Trump announced on Saturday that the U.S.-led strikes in Syria were a mission accomplished, adding that he had no intention of launching further strikes against President Bashar al-Assad's targets. Trump's announcement came hours after U.S., French and British forces launched strikes against 3 sites, which according to the U.S. president are associated with the chemical weapon capabilities of Assad. The coordinated strikes came as a response to the Syrian regime's alleged use of chemical weapons in Douma last week, killing scores of civilians. But the reality is far different from the reality on the ground in Syria, where many indicators point to the fact that the strikes did not cripple the Syrian government's capabilities, nor did it affect Assad's morale. The war in Syria, which entered its 8th year on March 15, has caused the destruction of most Syrian cities, killing nearly 500,000 people and forcing 6 million more to flee their homes. Yet the select bombardment of chemical facilities could not be expected to end a crisis on as big scale as Syria. According to several analysts, the strikes have achieved one goal only, not to provoke Russian forces in Syria, thus minimizing any possibility of an escalation between Moscow and Washington. Contrary to Trump's strong language and threats before the attacks, the mission did not have any impact and only helped Assad's regime to gain a new moral momentum. This failure, which Trump presented as a great achievement, was echoed in British Prime Minister Theresa May's statement, saying the strikes were not about regime change or intervening in a civil war, but were to deter the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government. French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian also said that the attacks did not target Syria's allies, in reference to Russia and possibly Iran and Hezbollah. Even the Pentagon, the U.S. Department of Defense, stated that the strikes were not aimed at changing Assad's regime, but rather were intended to deter Assad from using chemical weapons. Airstrikes largely symbolic. Various political analysts revealed that Trump's goal behind the strikes was simply to ease the burden of the scandals that had beset him in Washington, such as the FBI questioning of his personal lawyer Michael Cohen. Yet it remains unclear what effect, if any, the U.S.-led strikes had on alleviating the suffering of Syrians. On the battlefields, Assad forces are making more gains, and Syrian rebels continue to count their losses on various fronts. The majority of Syrians find themselves once again disappointed by those who call themselves friends of the Syrian people, while their reality stagnates or becomes even worse. Ibrahim al-Marashi, an associate professor of history at California State University, told Al Jazeera that the U.S. strikes embody largely symbolic actions with little consequence on the ground. This dissonance in U.S. policy to Syria reveals a lack of a coherent strategy, in contrast to Russia and Iran, which have demonstrated a steadfast determination in propping up Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, Marashi said. These attacks will not affect their long-term goal. According to Jonathan Crystal, a fellow at the World Policy Institute in New York City, for the attack to be successful, it needs to be backed up with shrewd diplomacy, and I am afraid that that is not really this U.S. administration's great strength. Push a new end to end Syria's chemical weapons following strikes. The United States, the United Kingdom and France are pushing for an irreversible end to Syria's chemical weapons program, amid furious recriminations from Russia over the effectiveness and legality of a wave of U.S.-led missile strikes on Syrian targets. UN diplomats shared with CNN a new resolution, led by France and backed by the United States and the United Kingdom, calling for an independent investigation into the suspected chemical weapons attack inside Syria that precipitated the cruise missile strikes unleashed by the Western allies on Friday. France's ambassador to the United Nations, François Delattre, said Syria's chemical weapons program must be dismantled in a verifiable and irreversible way. The renewed push for a UN-backed diplomatic solution follows a volatile emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, called by Moscow on Saturday, with Russia's UN ambassador, Vasily Nebenzo, condemning the joint US-British-French strikes as a violation of international law. Nebenza said Friday's missile strikes, targeted at facilities associated with the Syrian regime's chemical weapons program, had been a blow to the political settlement in the divided Middle Eastern nation. The Russian-led response to the strikes, though limited to words, comes amid days of building pressure and talk among UN diplomats of a potential new Cold War. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged all Security Council members to show restraint, as U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley told the meeting that Washington remains locked and loaded to respond to any future Syrian chemical attacks. Outside the UN, protests against the strikes were held around the world Saturday, including in major cities in the United States, Mexico, Greece and the United Kingdom. While some of the protesters came out in support of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime, many others were opposed to the use of military action by Western powers against Syria. New Chemical Weapons Resolution. Investigators from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW, arrived in Syria on Saturday to begin their investigation into the alleged chemical attack in the Syrian city of Douma. The team met with Syrian authorities in Damascus at 7 p.m. local time on Saturday, according to Syrian ambassador to the UN Bashar Jafari. It was the suspected chemical attack that led the Western allies to order the missile strikes, which they lay squarely at the feet of the Syrian regime. Senior U.S. officials said on Saturday they were confident both chlorine and sarin gas were used in the attack. Both the Syrian and Russian governments have denied Damascus' involvement in the attack. The new French-led resolution presented to the Security Council would have investigators from the OPCW report their findings to the UN within a new timetable. A Security Council diplomat told CNN there was no rush to vote on the draft resolution, but an attempt will be made to engage in serious negotiations. The resolution would also allow a third-party review of humanitarian evacuations from Douma and medical evacuations with no conditions. On Saturday the Syrian military announced on state television it had retaken eastern Ghouta, including the city of Douma, from rebels. A military official said all the terrorists have left Douma. Earlier on Saturday, a Russian resolution at the UN Security Council condemning the US-led strikes was voted down, gaining support from two other members, China and Bolivia. Ambassador Nebenza decried the resolution's failure to pass as a sad day for the world. Mission accomplished? The battle inside the Security Council came as U.S. President Donald Trump struck a triumphant tone in the wake of the strikes, on Saturday tweeting, "Mission accomplished." On Sunday, he defended the use of the term mission accomplished, which was widely mocked for repeating former President George Bush W. Bush's famous mission accomplished banner unfurled on an aircraft carrier during the Iraq conflict in 2003. The ill-fated banner appeared years before the U.S. mission in Iraq came to an end, and came to symbolize the president's seemingly misguided intervention in the region. Mission accomplished? The battle inside the Security Council came as U.S. President Donald Trump struck a triumphant tone in the wake of the strikes, on Saturday tweeting, "Mission accomplished." On Sunday, he defended the use of the term mission accomplished, which was widely mocked for repeating former President George Bush W. Bush's famous mission accomplished banner unfurled on an aircraft carrier during the Iraq conflict in 2003. The ill-fated banner appeared years before the U.S. mission in Iraq came to an end, and came to symbolize the president's seemingly misguided intervention in the region. The Syrian raid was so perfectly carried out, with such precision, that the only way the fake news media could demean was by my use of the term mission accomplished. I knew they would seize on this but felt it is such a great military term, it should be brought back. Use often. Trump tweeted. U.S. General Joseph Dunford, chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, said at a press briefing Saturday the strikes would set back Syria's chemicals weapons capability for years. He described the attack as precise, overwhelming and effective, saying they had targeted a scientific research center and two chemical weapons storage facilities on Friday. Satellite photos obtained by CNN of the areas targeted by the US, UK and French strikes showed extensive damage from the 105 missiles fired at the facilities. But Russia and Syrian authorities have disputed the assessment of the Pentagon, saying instead the vast majority of the incoming missiles were shot down by the country's military forces. The Russian Defense Ministry said only 7 missiles had reached 2 Syrian military airfields and that no serious damage to infrastructure was inflicted. Syrian state television said 3 civilians were wounded in Homs as a result of the strikes. Pressure builds. In the UK, Prime Minister Theresa May sought to shore up international support for the strikes, calling on the leaders of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Cyprus, Italy, Germany, Australia, and Canada, according to a statement from Downing Street. All of the leaders agreed with the Prime Minister on the importance of restoring the international norm that the use of chemical weapons is never acceptable, the Downing Street statement said. British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said Sunday there was no proposal on the table at the moment for further attacks, in an interview on the BBC's Andrew Marr show. This is not about regime change, or trying to turn the tide of conflict in Syria, Johnson added. It's about sending a message on the use of chemical weapons. May is expected to face questions in the British Parliament on Monday over the strike, which was launched without permission from the country's legislature. The UK Prime Minister is accountable to Parliament, not to the whims of the US President. I believe the action was legally questionable, and this morning the UN Secretary-General has said as much, UK opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn said in a letter to May Saturday. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Erdogan spoke on the phone Saturday about the strikes, according to Turkish state media. Turkey, a NATO member, has embarked on increased defense cooperation with Moscow, after the signing of an accord that will see Russia supply Ankara with state-of-the-art S-400 surface-to-air missile batteries. While Erdogan emphasized the need to de-escalate tensions, Putin reiterated that the Western nations had grossly breached the UN Charter and international law, according to Russian state media.